It is the night of the 12th of November 2019. Record levels of acqua alta are eating away at precious mosaics and destroying World Heritage landmarks. It is one of the darkest hours for Venice and its fragile lagoon ecosystem. 3 natural events, combined with half a century of corruption, have brought the city to its knees. The sheer survival of one of the most recognizable, romantic and beloved cities on earth, the pearl of the Adriatic, is now at stake. This is the sad story of how decades of ineptitude and corruption have destroyed hundreds of livelihoods and left the city of light and water on the edge of destruction.
La sirena. Siamo in gabbia.
The critical moment was when the sirens stopped. What we saw was like the day after tomorrow. It was like a war scene, total war. It looked as though there'd been a tornado, unexpected, unforeseeable, completely unforeseeable. But we took our boats out anyway, and once we'd sorted out our homes, we couldn't resist the temptation to see what happened. To St. Mark's and the rest of the southern lagoon that was very badly damaged. What we saw was shocking. What we saw was the powerlessness of the Venetians, of those of us who love Venice.
Di noi che amiamo Venezia.
Queste previsioni sono state sbagliate.
The weather forecasts were wrong. They were wrong, and I don't know why they were wrong. It's obvious that extra bad weather is difficult to predict with great precision. We were also betrayed by the alarm system.
Però siamo rimasti anche traditi dal sistema di allarme.
The water rose extremely fast in the last hour. It rose by 30 or 40 centimeters. In the last hour or hour and a half. Why? Because the Bora blows from the northeast, the Scirocco from southeast, and together they trap the water at Chioggia, where the water rose 50 centimeters. When the wind changed to Libeccio, or southwest, that blows from Chioggia to Venice, all this mass of water was sent back to Venice and reached Venice with this additional 40 centimeters. November the 4th, 1966. The world looked on aghast as an abnormal occurrence of high tides, rain-swollen rivers, and a severe Scirocco wind flooded Venice, causing the canals to rise to a record height of 194 centimeters. The high waters sparked a race against time to save the city. But instead of protecting Venice, this particular big engineering endeavor seems to have enriched a few by pouring money into private pockets and concrete onto the lagoon floor. More and more frequently, high tides and high winds push salty sea water through the heart of the city, already suffering damage from years of unfettered mass tourism. Could these be the final years of the Venice so many have known and loved for centuries? It is the night of the 12th of November of 2019. A strong southeasterly wind, known as the Scirocco, blows warm air towards the Alps, where it clashes with cold air from the north.
Acqua alta a Venezia, il livello stanotte ha superato i 180 centimetri.
Torrential rain and snow close mountain passes and swell the rivers. A highly unusual cyclone settles over the northern Adriatic. The deadly combination of climatic factors, a high autumn tide and the failure of an unfinished man-made surge barrier turn a natural phenomenon into a tragedy. Seawater is pushed through the 3 openings in the sand spits that run north to south that usually protect the shallow waters around Venice from the storms. The wind whips the lagoon waters into waves that crash into the islands and pushes the salty water first into St. Mark's Square, then the narrow streets and canals of Venice. This is not the brackish mix of fresh and salt water that usually surrounds Venice. It is the sea itself.
Verso le 17:30-18 del pomeriggio sono partite le raffiche di messaggi e le sirene.
Towards 5:30 or 6 of the afternoon, the messages and sirens began that forecast of a worsening situation, that with the last message and the last siren told us it would be catastrophic. Because the message that, due to extremely strong winds with gusts faster than 100 kilometers per hour, the high tide around 11 p.m. could reach 1.90 meters, close to the great flood of the 4th of November, 1966.
Avvicinandosi proprio a quella grande mareggiata del 4 novembre del 1966.
The wave isn't the usual soft tide that enters in slowly. The tide that in the Venetian lagoon breathes slowly, the tide that comes in and goes out with the same speed. This time, it was the sea itself that came in.
Per strada tutti erano impazziti e cercavano di spostare le auto e parcheggiare.
Everyone was in the street, trying to move their cars, to park them higher up. People in underwear and their high waders, trying to block the water. But the water came in like a tidal wave, wave after wave of stormy sea.
Una mareggiata, proprio un'ondata di mare in tempesta.
That night we came close to a tragedy, and out of pure luck there was no tragedy. Everyone in the world has seen the pictures of Riva degli Schiavoni, with the water buses beached on the street, not even half an arm's length from the bridges. This means that the ACTV water buses were lifted by the water and almost smashed into the bridge. The columns of the Doge's palace, the doors of the hotels, the Danieli or the Metropole, all the hotels in that area.
Il ponte, le colonne di Palazzo Ducale, cioè tutto quello che le porte degli alberghi, non so, del Danieli piuttosto che del Metropole, di tutti gli alberghi che ci sono su quella zona.
Le onde si sono insaccate all'interno del bacino della laguna.
The waves were trapped inside the lagoon and became as high as 2 meters, crashing into the Chioggia, Pellestrina, the most exposed areas of the city. The banks of Giudecca Island have disappeared. Windows were smashed. Boats and water buses sank. Boats cut loose. Water bus pontoons got detached and floated away. It was a catastrophe.
Dei vaporetti si sono staccati e sono andati alla deriva. Una catastrofe.
The freak weather added to the disaster. As the southeasterly wind blew seawater into the lagoon, the wind changed and became northeasterly, a wind called the Bora, that drove the seawater trapped in the lagoon southwards against the north banks of the city and the island of Murano. The 1,000-year-old church of San Donato was severely flooded.
This new alarm system that was set up in 2010 has been improved, and after the siren, that sounds like an anti-aircraft siren, that sends out wails according to the forecast tide. So after the siren, there's a first wail, which means 110, and then 2 means 120. Up to 4 wails means 140 and more. So 140 and more. What did that more mean? We simply didn't know. Only by calling each other, comparing notes, checking the tide warning center, were we able to understand that we could get to 190. There's a big difference.
Che fa una grande differenza.
The water began to rise in the heart of the city too, where the church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli, famed the world over for its marble facade, was swamped.
MOSE Venice has provided funding for the conservation of over 1,000 artworks in our 50-year history. One of our most important campaigns was the Church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli, which was restored inside and out, removing salts from all the marbles, the marble decoration of the church. We've returned to the Church of the Miracoli now after the floods because the church itself did go underwater, and we are dealing with problems with the floor and with the salts re-emerging after the seawater from the floods has dried.
Then the wind changed again and blew a deadly tidal wave against the already devastated city. It's the night of the 12th of November 2019, and Venice has been battered by 100-kilometre-an-hour winds, first from the southeast, then from the northeast. Salt water has been pushed into the lagoon, swelling the waters that have risen to over 1.5 meters above sea level. The city is prepared for 1.60 meters, with flood barriers at the entrances of homes and shops. But now, the situation gets even worse. The wind turns again, now blowing from the southwest, a wind the Italians call a lipeggio. The huge mass of water trapped in the south of the lagoon begins to move north. Silvio Testa is a veteran Venetian journalist and watched the unfolding events with horror.
La Bora soffia da nord-est, lo scirocco diciamo da sud-est.
The Bora blows from the northeast, the Scirocco from southeast, and together they trap the water at Chioggia, where the water rose 50 centimeters. When the wind changed to lipeggio, or southwest, that blows from Chioggia to Venice, all that mass of water was sent back to Venice, fast, and reached Venice with this additional 40 centimeters. Then I read a study written by the CNR, which said that we were even lucky because the high water caused by the wind and bad weather did not coincide with the actual lunar high tide. Because if the two had coincided, it would have been 2.20 meters or 2.30 meters.
Perché se avessero coinciso i due picchi avremmo avuto 2,20 metri, 2,30 metri.
The water rushed northwards at high speed, crashing into the Venetian waterfront and the lagoon-side shores of the outer islands. Shops, homes, libraries, and the city's architectural heritage were swamped by highly corrosive seawater. Homeowners and shopkeepers were already moving furniture and goods higher and higher until they ran out of height. Electrical appliances such as fridges and washing machines short-circuited and electrical wiring sparked out. The damage was also on the other islands of the lagoon. Pelestrina, Murano, Burano, quiet and quaint during the summer, were pummeled by 2-meter-high waves and 100-kilometre-per-hour winds. Lido, home to the Venice Film Festival and usually safe from the floods, was swamped by the high tide. The water pressure was so high that it broke a window in the crypt of St. Mark's, and the water poured in, overwhelming the pumps that had been installed to keep it dry. The 1,000-year-old mosaics and marble paving were soon awash with highly corrosive salt water. The world watched in shock and sadness as the water rose in the Basilica of St. Mark, one of the finest churches of the Western world. The crypt was soon submerged. The damage incalculable. The beautiful waterfront hallway of Palazzo Pisani, the city's music school, was knee-deep in water. Ancient homes that host the world-renowned biennial art festival were inundated.
qui in particolare abbiamo avuto intanto tutto questo.
This floor that you see is an ancient floor, an original marble floor that was completely covered in water and repeatedly covered in water in the following 10 days, causing an irreversible damage because not so much the water that is above, rather the water that gets in and goes below, because the water comes in from below, and it's salt water. And since it is salt water, it corrodes violently and irreversibly the material with a chemical reaction, and the same problem impacts the wooden structures, all the foundations and the wooden piles. But going back to the night of the 12th, what was particularly serious was that everything that we had put above 160 centimeters, and a little more, to be safe, was destroyed, and obviously all the ground floor apartments, some of which are storerooms, flats or offices, were flooded. It only takes 5 minutes of immersion to spoil everything. In this case, it lasted hours.
The financial loss to the city's inhabitants was massive, not to mention the damage to the cultural heritage, such as the destruction of autograph music scores in the music school. The floors and woodwork of the Gritti Palace along Venice's Grand Canal, a private residence turned luxury hotel, and the Venetian Gothic style Doge's Palace, and many of the city's churches. The banks of the world-famous Riva degli Schiavoni were devastated, and boats rammed up against bridges. In the Chiesa dei Carmini, the parish priest arrived to find water had covered the ancient marble floors and soaked the antique pews. He snapped pictures and then got to work with parishioners to try to move the water out.
Il problema è che si è imbevuto tutto per 4 ore, i banchi e le cose, insomma, questo, i marmi specialmente.
Ma è martedì?
Martedì è successo alla notte, non eravamo qua perché ho altre 2 parrocchie da guardare e quindi ero stato dietro a quelle, anche alla canonica che c'è di là. 30 centimetri in più, quindi per dire se oggi l'acqua è arrivata circa a questa altezza, aggiungeteci una spanna, martedì era fino a qua circa.
Chiara Pancino is librarian at the conservatory, where precious music manuscripts are stored. Here too there were tragic losses when the water rose above the expected high.
Il nostro deposito, vedete qui adesso stanno lavorando, per cui vediamo da che parte sono. Li hanno lasciati, se volete, l'acqua è arrivata, si vede un po' il segno più o meno a questo livello, eccolo qua, questo livello qua. Io ero tranquilla fino a 1,70 m, 1,75 m. La marea a 1,87 m, che come saprete bene immediatamente dopo quella del 1,94 m dell'alluvione ha preso tutti impreparati e purtroppo le cose si sono bagnate. Per esempio sono andati bagnati dei manoscritti con partiture di Cimarosa, poi c'era Galluppi, qualcosa di Rossini, edizioni anche storiche di Beethoven, le prime edizioni delle sinfonie di Beethoven, cose così.
Above all, the damage was to the livelihoods of ordinary Venetians. Without the citizens of Venice, the daily maintenance of the whole city as a living community would crumble.
Questo è l'unico MOSE che funziona e costa 6 euro. È arrivata fino a qua circa. Tutto il laboratorio mi è andato sotto, ma il problema non è stata tanto l'acqua che ha tenuto fino a un certo punto, è che sono scoppiate le fogne. Quindi, come si dice in veneziano, avevo 35 centimetri di merda.
l'acqua. Secondo anche la testimonianza che io di sera non ero qua, dell'inquilino qua sopra, valicato la muretta, quindi fa conto che le barche erano qui a filo, è arrivata e fa conto in proporzione, è entrata anche dalle finestre a questo livello qua, circa, così. Tieni conto che non è solo qui ma anche da sotto, no? Del pavimento, possibili fughe, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi le paratie non possono essere sufficienti, le pompe saltate perché è saltato l'impianto elettrico, basta, cioè, eccessiva. Già le acque quando sono 1,50, 1,60 sono eccezionali, questo bisogna ricordarselo. Cioè a 1 e quasi 90 è stra eccezionale, è una cosa, cioè è un dramma. Cioè, io altri introiti non ne ho. Per cui o vivo con questo, se no non lo so, bisogna in qualche maniera riprendere. Tanto importante è che finisca sto ciclo di acque, che fra l'altro è parecchio lungo, più degli altri anni, non la smette più.
They pay for the upkeep of their homes. They keep the city's economy alive with ordinary, everyday actions. Although its native population is dwindling, Venice is not a museum. It's a living city, in winter and in summer.
E come a Euro Disneyland si va a vedere la casa degli specchi, la casa delle streghe e via dicendo, la cale delle tette.
It's like Euro Disneyland. You go to see the Hall of Mirrors, the House of the Witches and so forth, la cale delle tette, the casinos, la cale dei botteri, the traders' shops, the fondaci, and you see a city that once existed and is no more. No, this would be missing an incredible opportunity. It's like the Americans destroying the native population. It's similar. It's as though we were seeing a conscious destruction of a very important part of our city. This city has an incredible anthropological heritage of immense value and barely hangs on because we are stubborn, with our Venetian accent, our long eyes and double letters. We are stubborn and demand that Venice be recognized as a whole city with its inhabitants.
Venezia è una città unicum con I suoi cittadini.
The Acqua Alta is not just a normal flood, but an increasingly frequent phenomenon that has been made worse by decades of mismanagement and destruction of the lagoon's natural balance, that has left the city on the brink of utter annihilation. And yet, the catastrophe might have been avoided if the steel walls of Venice's new surge barrier had deployed. But the imposing concrete and steel mega-engineering project called MOSE stayed firmly anchored to the bottom of the lagoon. Only 2 weeks after the devastating flood, under the cover of the darkness of night, did the consortium in charge of building and managing the surge barrier actually perform a secret test on the system, in conditions considerably more favourable. The very survival of the city of Venice depends on the health of the lagoon that surrounds it. It stretches over 550 square kilometres, from the river Sile in the north to the Brenta in the south. The city of Venice and the small islands around it account for only 8% of the whole area. The rest is made up of mudflats and tidal shallows and salt marshes. It is one of the Mediterranean basin's largest wetlands and has provided crucial protection to Venice over the centuries. The lagoon opens into the open sea in 3 places: in the south at Chioggia, in the centre at Malamocco, and in the north and right in front of Venice is the Lido entrance, the widest. These seaward channels have been deeply dredged to allow heavy shipping into the lagoon, profoundly transforming the very nature of the waters around Venice.
Il far entrare il mare, la violenza del mare, aprire i canali, non pulire i canali.
Letting in the force of the sea, digging channels, not cleaning out the city's canals, but opening wide shipping channels around Venice. means taking the irreversible responsibility for changing a natural system that is extremely delicate. That is the Venice Lagoon system.
Che ha un equilibrio proprio sottile, che è il sistema della laguna di Venezia.
When the water rises, no longer to 60 centimeters, but to 180 or even 120, the ratio of seawater and fresh water changes, and this impacts the fauna and the flora and the consistency of the water.
Ha delle refluenze immediate nella fauna, nella flora e soprattutto nell'acqua, nella consistenza dell'acqua.
Quando c'era bassa marea.
When there was a low tide, you could see land from San Giorgio all the way to Lido. Now you can't see anything. Once, you could wade with the water up to your knees all the way to San Clemente or San Servolo, even the area close to the Giudecca, where we'd go and play. Now, I mean, not close to the Giudecca, but today, towards San Marco a Bocca, where the Venetian galley is, or close to the oil tanker channel, the water is 2 or 2.5 meters deep. It's the sea. Fishermen say the fish have changed. There are no longer any go, but you find sea fish, sea bass at Murano, or breams that were never found before. The city of Venice itself is a marvel of architecture, built on millions of wooden piles inserted into the mud and brackish water to create artificial foundations for the houses. Around the 13th century, the city began flourishing as a trading point between the Near East and the wealthy courts of Western Europe. A new building technique was needed, and the Venetians came up with some incredible ideas. Venetian engineers understood the workings of the lagoon and knew that there would be high and low tides. So, on the one hand, they kept the canals dredged, and on the other, they used alternate layers of brick and marble as the foundation of the buildings. The marble from Istria, now in Slovenia, kept the water from seeping into the brickwork. And since the taller the buildings were, the lighter they had to be, the outer walls were also the supporting structure. The overall weight of the building was reduced by the presence of large windows, a unique characteristic in the Middle Ages. This city was built on 124 mud flats, held together by millions of wooden piles and joined by 400 bridges. Since ships and boats travelling on rivers and sea remained the fastest mode of transport until the invention of the internal combustion engine, Venice's place in the lagoon made it the richest city in the West. But there were problems. The rivers Brenta and Sile brought silt into the lagoon and blocked the waterways. So, from the 16th century, the Venetians built channels to alter the course of the rivers and save the lagoon. Over the centuries, the city of Venice established a balance between its trade over the open sea, the health of the brackish lagoon, and the solidity of its foundations. The tides were the key to keeping La Serenissima healthy. The brackish water is perfect for the health of the foundations. The light architecture can survive a limited amount of subsidence too. It was not until the 20th century, however, that high waters rather than low began to impact the city. By then, it was a shadow of its former self. Although water is the city's source of wealth, the industrial heartland of Veneto beyond the lagoon poses a mortal threat and is the real challenge to its survival. Over the decades, Venice and its lagoon have been subject to radical transformation and unfettered exploitation. The growth of the industrial cities of Porto Marghera and Mestre sucked water from the water table under Venice while on the other hand, deep channels were carved into the lagoon floor to allow ships to access the mainland ports and shipyards. Worse still came with the exponential rise of mass tourism in the form of cruise vacations. Huge ships carrying 6,000 people, literally floating cities, pass right by St. Mark's Square. They are even more devastating than the cargo ships, as their wakes not only flatten the lagoon floor, but their idling engines pump hundreds of tons of sulfur into the air of a city that has no cars. Mass tourism is one of the greatest contributors to the death of Venice, but it also provides a living to many of its inhabitants. Finding the right balance is the key to saving the city. Over the centuries, Venice has been a place of inspiration for the great poets and artists. The unique cultural and architectural heritage of a city built on water and navigated largely by boat has also been the city's downfall, as it has become one of the must-see sites for tourists of every kind. In June of 2019, a 300-meter ship collided with a dock and a small tourist boat in the city's Giudecca Canal, one of Venice's most important waterways, injuring 5 people. And there were calls for a ban on grandi navi, big ships, before it is too late.
Non si apre questa!
Chiara Donà delle Rose has a proposal to make tourists pay for the spectacle of Venice as a living city.
Ipotizziamo che ci sono 2000 persone dentro una nave, che sono queste più o meno le cifre.
Let's say that there are 2,000 people in a ship. These are the figures more or less. And let's divide the whole ship by 2,000 people. The cubic meters of the ship, so every person on the ship moves, we worked it out, about 70 cubic meters of water. So, as soon as someone sets foot in Venice, either they pay the feet tax or the sea tax, the tax for walking on Venice or the tax for looking at Venice from his or her own balcony. Or they will be doused in 70 cubic meters of water with the same violent force that he or she forces onto my city. That's just an idea, obviously metaphorical, but it's a way of understanding what's happening.
Però a questo punto bisogna toccare con mano quello che sta accadendo.
Apart from mass tourism, subsidence, flooding, and airborne pollution from ships, the growth of the petrochemical industries on the mainland has also undermined the lagoon. Giuseppe Gambolati of Padua University has studied the multiple threats to Venice over the years.
Dunque Venezia ha subito un abbassamento.
Venice has sunk, due to human activities, during the 1950s and 60s by about 12 centimeters. Then this sinking stopped in the 1970s because the sinking was due to the extraction of underground water, especially for industrial use in Porto Marghera.
The combination of rising seas and sinking sea floor is catastrophic, increasing flooding and erosion of Venice's buildings.
In the last century, the 20th century, we estimate that the average sea level has risen by 12 or 13 centimeters. So the sum of the rising sea level and the sinking terrain comes to a total of 25 centimeters. So the city of Venice, over the last century, has lost over 25 centimeters in height with respect to the average sea level.
The rising water is causing serious and specific damage to the city's buildings, even when flooding remains within the normal limits. The typical Venetian house is constructed of bricks with a damp course of Istrian limestone that stops water rising and damaging the bricks above. The ground floor of the larger houses also had a well, which drew on rainwater collected in massive cisterns under the street or flooring of the house. The wooden floors and roof beams and, where necessary, chains were used to literally hold the house together. Today, most of the city's transport is by motorboat or barge. The buses are the diesel-fueled vaporetti, while hundreds of outboard engines are used to power transport boats all over the city. The waves from these propellers are slowly but steadily eroding the cement between the bricks. The constant churning of water in the canals has had a devastating effect on the foundations of the buildings. In order to reduce the churning that is eroding Venice's foundations, there is a speed limit on motorboats, and Venice traffic police monitor and photograph speeding boats. In 1966, just 50 years ago, in some places the sea level reached 2 meters higher than average. The question of saving Venice from sinking and the rising sea levels became a national and international priority, and a plan for a massive protection system was set in motion. The project for a surge barrier to block high tides was born and given the name of MOSE, which stands for Experimental Electromechanical Module. It involves positioning dozens of floating barriers on the sea floor to be raised every time an exceptional tide is expected. Over 6 billion euros have been sunk into the most ambitious surge barrier ever built. The idea that Venice could be saved from flooding by mobile dikes that lift up from the sea floor goes back to the 1970s, when big engineering projects were common to solve everyday problems. The MOSE project is managed by a private consortium called Consorzio Venezia Nuova, based in the regenerated arsenal of Venice, and has been dogged by administrative and legal obstacles, and also by the biggest corruption scandal the city of Venice has ever seen.
Il consorzio ha creato un monte di denaro in nero.
They created a slush fund by paying the suppliers a higher fee than required against invoices that did not correspond to the actual work done.
Non corrispondevano ai lavori fatti, no? E poi le ditte che ricevevano più soldi recedevano al consorzio una parte di questo denaro.
So the companies that received more money sent some of it back to the consortium, under the table. So the companies earned more money, they were cooperating with the consortium, and the consortium created a slush fund that they used. At least that's what the investigation says, so as to pay people who had to authorize the work as it progressed.
Chi doveva autorizzare l'avanzamento dei lavori.
The disaster of the 12th of November 2019 raised serious questions about how the project has been designed and managed. The mayor of Venice at the time the project was launched asked naval engineer Vincenzo Di Tella to present an alternative project to the government that involved a gravity-based system, with gates that were raised not facing the tide, but lying in the opposite direction.
Questo progetto fu scelto dal comune come alternativa al MOSE.
This project was chosen by the city as an alternative to the MOSE because the costs were 1/5 of the costs of the MOSE. The cost of maintenance, if you compare the two, would have been 1% of the cost of the project, which is the norm, not the 120 million euros we're talking about today. So they brought me to Rome to speak to the technical committee about the issues, where I would have said what were the weak points of the MOSE and what were the advantages of the gravity-operated barriers.
Bene, quando loro mi videro, non mi fecero neppure parlare. Sulla base di questo, poi è successo che il...
When they saw me, they didn't even let me speak. On the basis of this, the technical commission of the city, seeing that their proposal had been rejected, decided to give the matter to the French company Principia to study the dynamic behavior of the MOSE barriers and the gravity barriers.
Esaminare il comportamento dinamico dell'apparatore MOSE e dell'apparatore a gravità.
An international group of experts called in to evaluate the project made two recommendations that were ignored. One was to verify that it did not produce dissonance, and the other that mathematical models be used to design the final project. The French company, hired by the city of Venice, highlighted a design flaw that they identified in the MOSE. The instability which occurred under sea conditions with a wave frequency of more than 8 seconds, with the different reaction of the independent gates according to their position along the whole barrier, as each moving gate produced its own waves that interfered with the incoming sea. The test basins where the walls were tried out were too small to properly simulate the behavior of this massive structure during real high tides. No serious mathematical models of the MOSE in operation were attempted. How the MOSE will react to high seas and strong winds is still a concern. Vincenzo Di Tella has been asked by the consumer protection watchdog Codacons to analyze the project.
Dynamic instability means that when I move the gate with a regular sea, waves of 8 seconds, the wall reacts not only at 8 seconds, but also at 16, so half the wavelength. And this is called subharmonic frequency, or dynamic instability. There is no mathematical model that can simulate it, and the tests carried out in the water basin are affected by the scale effect, so are not realistic. In the sea, viscosity is real, while in the test basin it's artificial. I could find that the gate goes and beats against the bottom of the sea or against the reinforced concrete structures and breaks off.
The MOSE is designed to protect Venice from high tides. When a high tide is predicted on the basis of wind and tidal data, compressed air is pumped into the barriers, which rise slowly to the surface, blocking the influx of water from the Adriatic Sea. Access to the hinges for maintenance is via 2 service tunnels built into the concrete housings, 20 meters underwater. Should these flood, there is an emergency access door in the next room for divers to enter. These have to be kept watertight and are regularly checked. Giovanni Zarrotti is the lead engineer on the MOSE project. He has seen it grow over the years and now heads up the team that will bring it to fruition.
In all, there are 78 barriers, but more were actually built because there are 2 spare barriers for every lagoon entry. And the reason for this is that these barriers will have a periodic need for maintenance. So in order not to leave the place where the barrier has been removed without, while it is being repaired, the extra and identical barrier is positioned there as soon as the barrier due for maintenance is removed.
The effects of the different water levels can be seen in this graph, where the amount of flooding is shown in blue. Tides of 80 centimeters automatically flood St. Mark's Square and a few other places. But with the sea at 130 centimeters, the whole city is flooded. It is a hard decision to make to close the water barrier and brings enormous responsibility.
Andrebbero prese le paratoie come sono state realizzate dalla una società tipo Principia, ma ci sono.
They should take the gates as they have been built and give them to an outside company like Principe or others in the world, Norwegians or Americans or others, that can simulate this and analyze if they work or not.
Funziona, allora si prosegue, si cerca di fare il sistema di controllo come Dio comanda e poi
And if they do, proceed and try to create a system of checking them properly.
Bisogna fermarsi ed evitare di fare una figuraccia di fronte al mondo.
And if they don't, we need to stop the whole thing and avoid making a bad impression on the whole world. Because to find ourselves with a high water and waves and find one of the gates washed up in Piazza San Marco would be a terrible thing to see.
Questa è un po' la nostra posizione.
The MOSE was conceived of to protect Venice from high water, but also to guarantee access to the port system of Venice. If we had not had a port inside the lagoon, we would not need the MOSE. But why have they had to maintain the canals that lead to the oil refineries and have dug all these deep channels to bring ships into the industrial areas? All these major access points, these enormous autostrade. It is because there is the port. Otherwise, we could have done an entirely different kind of intervention.
Quello che diciamo va detto, perché recentemente tutti quanti.
Well, I have to say that since everybody's saying that at this point we've done 90%, we might as well finish the project and see how it works, I have to say this is technically absurd. According to the best practices, the test run is done by comparing it with the project plans. But if there's no project plan, how are you supposed to do a test run?
Avviene verificando se quello che è stato realizzato corrisponde al progetto. Se invece io non ho il progetto e il MOSE non ha un progetto, lei mi dica come faccio io a fare con l'auto.
Ho come l'impressione che loro dicono che sono il 93.
My impression is it's been said they have 93 or 94% of the work done, but I think it is more like they have finished 93 or 94% of the funds available. There is still work to be done. For example, the electrical command centers to control the surge barrier, the part of the electrical mechanics to control the single gates. Very complex systems. Perhaps there are those thinking the worst who suggest that perhaps they do not really want to finish it because they too have their doubts.
Pensando male, crede che non vogliano finirlo perché hanno anche loro delle perplessità su quello che potrà essere.
On the fateful night of the 12th of November 2019, the sea walls on the island of Palestrina, built by the consortium, actually contributed to the disaster by keeping the water on the island. However, the sea surge did come from an unexpected direction, the lagoon.
Il leitmotiv dopo l'acqua alta di questi giorni.
The leitmotiv after the high water of these days was, we have to finish the MOSE, as if it were the only problem, ignoring the pollution, the changing lagoon, subsidence, erosion, the poor management of tourism. It seems the special law is just reduced to creating a tap at the mouth of the port, and everything else is just a detail.
E che tutto il resto sia secondario e destinato a passare in cavalleria.
Noi siamo consapevoli che appena l'acqua se ne va via, appena noi mettiamo.
We realize that as soon as the high water goes away, after we have fixed everything back up, everyone will have forgotten. It will be February and there will be Carnival, and in May the Biennale of Venice. Everyone will come in here and use Venice like a beautiful red carpet that belongs to everyone, and they will spend billions on parties, but in the end, there is nothing left for Venice. It is a vain and selfish perception of Venice, which is made up of fishermen and regular people who go to courthouses and schools and live their lives like in every other city in the world.
Che vive la sua vita come tutte le altre città del mondo.
However close the city came to destruction, Venetians woke up to the arrival of droves of volunteers from around the region who came to help the ordinary Venetian shopkeepers and save the city's great cultural heritage.
È stato messo in salvo parecchio materiale, da quanto io so, grazie anche.
A lot of things were saved thanks to the help of volunteers. who rushed down to the city. There was a solidarity, a network of solidarity and help that was incredible. The young, especially. People came from Padova, from outside of Venice. I was moved.
Incredibile. I giovani, soprattutto, ma sono venuti anche fuori Venezia, da Padova. Io sono commossa, devo dire la verità. È una delle cose.
I have to tell you the truth. It took a bit of the bitterness of these days away to see how the others responded.
The cleanup began, and a few days later, the sun came out on a city that had found its will to survive even the worst disaster. The university building of the Ca' d'Oro was one of the architectural marvels that enjoyed the first restoration efforts.
When the flood hit on the 12th of November and then continued the series of floods through all of November, Say Venice launched a special appeal. We were joined by the Italian embassy in Washington, and they called the campaign Americans Love Venice. And together we've been raising funds that we've been using to help clean the churches, to desalinate marble, to clean out the waterlogged debris. We're also working at Ca' d'Oro Museum. The ground floor was about 190 hours, I believe, total underwater during the month. And so it's important to work fast, and that's what Say Venice has been able to do, to find out where there's a need and work immediately.
È importante pensare che I veneziani ci sono, esistono.
It is important to know that Venetians exist. They were those who were born here, some in this hospital or another, or in the home because some are still born at home. All of those who chose to live here and who desire to stay. All the students who come here to study want to stay here. Once you enter in the rhythm of the city of Venice, you realize that it is the most beautiful city of the world, not just because of the stone, but because of the pace, because it is a human rhythm with humanity at its center.
Che è un ritmo umano, cioè proprio l'umanità è al centro.
Venezia è una città specialissima, bellissima. Io credo che non potrei vivere in...
Venice is such a special, beautiful city. I could not live in any other place because there is this human dimension, the sea, the lagoon, the contact with the others, and we walk. We're not closed in these little boxes with wheels. Even taking the vaporetto, the water bus, it is so beautiful. I can't even read while I'm riding on it because I have to look around me. I was born here, and it is what I've seen around me since I've been born, and yet I am still not used to it. To save the city of Venice is to save its residents, to guarantee their right to live as citizens, to guarantee their right to their activities, which risk being swept away with these high tides.
Che sono state spazzate con questa mareggiata.
At 1.87 m at its highest point, the Acqua Alta of November 2019 is the second highest flood ever recorded. These floods happen several times a year, but they are getting more frequent and adding to decades of damage caused by mass tourism, rising sea levels, incompetent and corrupt government. The city of light and water, La Serenissima, is at risk as never before of disappearing beneath the very waters that sustained her for centuries.